So let us continue with what we were discussing in the previous class. Uh, let us brush up what we did so that you can connect it to today's discussion like we do all the time, right? So I want some of you to just revise. Yeah, good afternoon. If you can just recall whatever you remember, what we discussed last time. So those who were present or those who heard the recording, maybe. What did we discuss last time? Can anyone tell me? Yeah. Kushi, can you unmute yourself? What do you remember about German philosophers we discussed? Okay. So does anyone else remember what we discussed about German philosophers last time? Shikha, Amanatullah. Yeah, we discussed about Marxism and Hegel's dialectics, right? So what did we talk about Hegel, Hegel's dialectics? Yeah, Amatullah, what do you remember? Shikha, do you remember anything from our previous class? Yeah, Pankti has also joined. About the three parts, yeah, of dialectic. And what are those? Okay, you can type if you want, Amatullah. What are those three parts, Kushi? Thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Okay. So what are those? What is thesis? What is antithesis? And what is synthesis? Does Pankti remember anything from our last class, day before yesterday?
Um, Sir, no, actually, I don't.
You were in the class, right?
Yes, sir, I was in the class, but I was in Auro's campus and the Wi-Fi is not working from a few days there.
Mm-hmm.
I was
So
in the
how?
campus, I was on campus in the library.
Okay.
So I was continuously joining and yeah, so there
Okay.
were some issues also.
So you could hear nothing from our 2 hours. You didn't hear two words
Yes.
also, or you heard one word, one and a
Um,
half words of what we discussed. I think what you need to do, all of you, is to read parallelly as we go along. And the books that I have prescribed are, one is History of Literary Criticism by M.A.R. Habib, and second one is Reader's Guide to Literary Criticism by Raman Selden. So these are the two books I am using, which you can use to read parallelly with me. Right? I'm not. Neither should you limit yourself to these two books, but these are something basic that you should keep with you. Otherwise, I think that what seems to be happening is that while we are discussing, it still remains in the air unless it is followed up by reading. So the classroom discussions will not be of much use if you don't read parallelly. That is very important, and because classroom discussions are like preaching, right? And we don't remember what is being preached. And this is the situation in one day. We discussed some of these things on Thursday, and now you're blank, right? So you should be reading parallelly. Okay, so we discussed Hegel's dialectics, and as Khushi points out, it has got three parts: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. But these are not the phrases or terms that Hegel himself promotes, right? He talks about dialectic as a kind of progress that happens through negation. And instead of being, his focus is on becoming. So things, self-consciousness or the world around us is not being, but a process, right? And human consciousness, self-consciousness, and the awareness of the world, something which is called phenomenology, right? Or the science of human experience, uh, or scientific study of human experience. Philosophical approach to studying human consciousness is called phenomenology, right? And his book called Phenomenology of Spirit or Phenomenology of Mind, German word Geist is translated as spirit in some place or mind as some in some other place. Talks about how self-consciousness unfolds. So when you are born, you have a kind of general awareness of everything and yourself, which is immediate, right? A kind of sensation, world of sensations that you uh, inhabit when you are born. But slowly and gradually, you start defining yourself in contrast to other things, right? So this is the next stage where you start defining yourself in terms of contradictions or negations, that you are not your mother, you are not that wall, who you are is given by the opposites. So So contradiction, according to Hegel, is a good thing, and it brings about a progress, right? So the next stage is that of self-awareness, which is through negation of the earlier stage. And final stage is when the entire self-consciousness results in some sort of self-realization as absolute. What do we mean by that? We mean that we no longer define ourselves as opposites of something, but something which is all encompassing, larger kind of unity. And this third stage of negation is also sublation, where the opposites are retained and at the same time they are negated. And the example that I gave was your identity as, say, for example, Gujarati is offered when you are in contrast to non-Gujaratis. Say, for example, when you go to Tamil Nadu, then you become Gujarati. Otherwise, here everybody is Gujarati, right? So that your self-identity is a product of negation and contrast. And that is a progressive step from first general phase of immediacy. And then the higher forms of sublation would be when you identify yourself as Indians, right? And that also happens when you are define yourself against non-Indians. And that is a higher form of identification, which does not negate your being Gujarati and someone else being Tamil, right? So that's a higher form of self-consciousness. So you can see that this process of negation and progress is also the theory of history that Hegel gives, that history also is a process which is governed by this law of dialectic. So dialectic is an underlying principle for personal history as well as history as with capital H, right? Larger history. So history is driven by these forces of dialectic. So dialectic is the underlying law of history. And we also discuss, if you remember, something called master-servant dialectic. Does anyone remember this? Those who were present? Khushi, Shikha, Tatsam, Amatullah, Pankti. I don't know if Rohit was present. Rohit, you're joining for the first time?
Hello.
Yeah, Rohit.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. So you're joining for the first time?
No. I think, sir, it's my third time.
Okay.
I'm in second.
So last time you were there in the class, I don't remember. That's why.
So I do remember the master-slave dialectic.
Right. So can you tell me something
Hello.
about it?
Yes, sir.
Hello.
Yeah, Rohit. Go ahead.
Yes, sir.
Rohit
So,
wants
sir,
to say something.
Sir, I
After that,
can't.
you
Yes,
can
sir.
tell.
I mean,
Yeah.
there is some network issue. So,
Okay. Where are you from,
Yes, sir.
Rohit? Anyway, okay, Tatsam, go ahead.
Yes, sir. So, sir, it's a very good known passage of Friedrich Hegel's.
It is
And sir,
GHW Hegel, something like GWF
yes,
Hegel. Good.
G.W. Friedrich, Friedrich Hegel,
Yeah,
right, sir?
yeah.
And
So
it
his
was
name was
sir,
not Frederick. His name was something like George something.
George William Friedrich Hegel's.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So what does he say in master-servant dialectic?
Yes, sir. Let me explain you. Like it was like it was considered as a key element in Hegel's philosophical system.
Right. And what is it?
Sir, just a second. In my notes, uh, Say,
Right? Everybody should develop this practice of taking notes, running notes in the class, because that matters for your understanding, as well as while preparing at the time of examination. You need to brush up the classroom discussion when you are reading something, right?
yes, sir. It's like, sir, the motion of recognizing,
Hmm.
in which the like two self consciousness are constituted like that.
Hmm. Correct.
Huh.
Right. So when you are recognizing yourself as masculine, you are usually defining yourself in contradiction or contrast to uh, non-masculine, that is feminine maybe. Right. So what happens according to him, that this otherness becomes a problem for consciousness. And while on one hand you want to destroy that otherness, on the other hand, you also need that otherness to define who you are. Otherwise, you would not become who you are. Right? So there is this contradictory tension of desire in some form for the other, at the same time, kind of desire to destroy the other. So this is a kind of paradoxical nature of desire, of self-recognition. Now, what happens because of this desire and tension is it results in a kind of violent struggle where somebody has to accept that person's position as either master or a slave, and a dominant and dominated. So, a kind of tendency to dominate and get dominated is a part of human existence, according to the master-servant dialectic. Right? And this becomes violent. And later Hegel will go on to say that in case there is no sublation happening, by sublation you mean both the opposites are retained, but at the same time they are superseded by higher form of unity. When that happens, when that does not happen, right, is that it results in bitter conflict that continues for a long time, and it results in what he calls unhappy consciousness. Unhappy consciousness is that consciousness which has either resigned itself, ab kuch nahi ho sakta, there is no resolution of this conflict, right? So there is either resignation or there is some sort of acceptance of it. And one very good example of unhappy consciousness is religion, according to Hegel. Religion is a form of unhappy consciousness. You accept that the conflict will not be resolved at any higher level of unity, right? So the conflict continues for a long time. So that is unhappy consciousness, a very important idea in Hegel. Then we also looked at the idea of alienation, right, in the context of Hegel's thought. Hegel thought that labor and work is an expression of yourself, including literature or whatever work that you do is an expression of yourself, and that is what connects Hegel to Romanticism as well, because Romanticism sees art as expression of your subjectivity, right? And that's why Hegel is a very important influence on other American Romantic thinkers like Emerson and many others, right? Because art is seen as expression of who you are, subjectivity. And that is what T.S. Eliot, if you remember, is critical of, right? Art as not an expression of who you are, but a kind of escape from who you are, right? Your personality. But Hegel says that work is an expression of yourself. And so in this dialectic, very often there is an alienation that person feels because of master-servant dialectic. That say for and the example that I give, that your maid servant cooks for you, then for maid servant that work is expression of who she is, but she does not own it. So she cannot relate to it as if it's her own. Neither can the master or mistress of the house feel that it is her own, right? So the ownership is what, that sense is lost in alienation. And we discussed this at length because Marx is turning it on its head. So Marx's view of history is a kind of reversal of Hegelianism, in the sense that Hegel is an idealist. For him, rationality is the core driving machinery of dialectic. Reason is the driving machinery. For Marx, it is the material forces of history that are dialectical rather than thinking, right? So consciousness for Hegel is a kind of a transcendental thing. But for Marx, consciousness is social and historical. It's a construct of social and historical forces, right? So history, according to Marx, is also dialectical. And he says that feudalism was a product of negation of earlier modes of production. Maybe the nomadic or tribal modes of production, right? Then capitalism was a negation of feudalism. And Marx would argue that later on, communist society or the classless society is an outcome of this negation of capitalism, which is a negation of feudalism. So this twice negation results in communist classless society, right? So the highest form of society, according to Marx, is the classless one. And the history is driven by the conflict between the master and the servant class, right? The masters are the bourgeoisie who own the means of production, and servants are the people who work on these means of production. So there is a class conflict. So class conflict is the driver of history. History moves in a linear way. There is a kind of teleology, or the ultimate end or the goal of history, which according to Hegel is the ultimate self-realization of absolute. And that is also ultimate state of freedom according to Hegel, because reason according to Hegel is freedom. So for Marx, the ultimate telos or the teleology or the ultimate purpose of history is the result of, is the production of classless society where nobody owns the means of production, nobody owns the property, right? So there is no private property in a communist society, and the means of production, whether it's industry or factory, are owned by all. So that is the aim of Marxism, right? To bring about a revolution in order to produce a communist society. And that is what he means by communist, right? Very often there is a term called socialist that is also used for communist, but socialist is a broader category, right? Communist is more specific, a Marxist kind of understanding of it. Though they are used interchangeably at times. For example, Soviet Union was Soviet Socialist Republic, right? And we discussed how after 1917, there was a rebellion against Tsars and industrialists in Russia, bringing about formation of United Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, which collapsed in 1989. So from 1917 to 1990, roughly, you can say for 72 years, Russia was under the communist rule. And from 1945 onwards, after the Second World War, two superpowers were engaged in battle for dominating the world. One was America and allies called the NATO countries, right? NATO, versus Soviet and their allies. So the world was enlocked in this struggle between capitalism, democracy and capitalism, and Soviet Union and totalitarianism of Russia. By totalitarianism, you mean that totality of power is in the hands of few ruling sections of the society. A kind of dictatorship, right? So that period is called the Cold War period, 1945 to 1990. Okay. We also discussed the question of ideology, right? Did we? Does anybody remember?
Sorry, sir, could you please repeat?
The question of ideology and contradictions within capitalist society. Did we discuss these points? Does anyone remember?
No, sir.
Okay, I do remember the contradiction. Marx argues that there are various contradictions in capitalist society, like desire to reduce the wages and results in increasing profit, right? If you pay your workers less, you will make more profit. But at the same time, you are reducing the demand in the society, so that your products are not sold at the end of it. That again affects your production. So when Marx uses the term contradiction, he is thinking of contradiction within totality of society, an idea that comes again from Hegel, where totality means the entire society is made up of various parts, right, whose essence is found in all of the parts. The essence of the whole is found in all of the parts. So contradiction in one results in an opposing force rising in society. There is definitely one contradiction is between the capitalist and workers, right? The bourgeoisie and the proletariat, as they used to say. This is a contradiction, right? Other contradiction can be, say for example, contradiction between desire, what is known as division of labor. Now, what do you mean by division of labor? That if you want to increase production, suppose you are making soap, then you need to employ 20 people doing 20 different things, so that the number of soaps that you produce are increased. There is an increase in number of soaps you produce, right? And to increase that profit and production, you have further division of labor. So division of labor results in what Marx would call alienation in society. That means no one working in the factory feels that the soap is a product of his work, that he has only contributed to one part of making that soap. Unlike, say, a farmer who works on his own field, feels that all his work, all the produce that he has is his own produce, so he owns it. But the worker working in a factory never feels that he owns that soap. So division of labor very often results in alienation of the workers. And you can see how it's a Hegelian idea again. And this alienation results in discontent among laborers, right? Another thing that results in discontent among laborers is exploitation. That they work for 10 hours, but they are actually paid for 4 hours, right? So 6 hours is extra labor results in profit. That produces the surplus. So surplus is a product of extra work that workers do, for which they are not paid. And that also results in discontent among the workers. Now, all these things result in what Marx would call revolution leading to a communist state. So all trade union movements are very often desire for increasing wages, reducing work hours or quality of work, and so on. So Marxism is intrinsically tied to the trade union movements in an industrialized, capitalized world, right? So this is also a very important idea that we have to keep in mind. Then, if you remember, we mentioned ideology. Ideology, by ideology, we mean our way of thinking, way of looking at our life, our world, beliefs, something that we accept as true, universal, natural, all values we consider important, not important. So ideology is a set of those ideas, beliefs, practices, philosophical systems, religion, literature, arts. All that is called ideology. Marx argues, and that is very important in Marxist theory, is that ideology is a reflection of class conflict. Means each class would have a different set of beliefs and ideology. And the dominant class always wants to make its own way of thinking, its own value system, its own beliefs to be a kind of general. It wants its specific ideology to be generalized or acceptable to the entire society, right? And Marx give example of how feudalism was replaced by industrial capitalism. Industrial feudalism believed in values like honor and loyalty, but bourgeois or the industrial capitalism emphasize freedom and equality as against loyalty and honor, right? You can see how value system is related to class and economic arrangement, right? So our values, according to Marx, are expressions of our class interests. That is a very important argument that he makes. Would you agree to this position? What's your take on this? Our way of thinking, believing, looking at life is an expression of our economic and social class interests.
So, I mean, I think, like, to a certain extent, that is true. Like, our way of thinking is affected by the class interests around us, or what we are part of, or the society or upbringing in a way.
Right.
But I think that is where, I suppose, like, that is when we're going out and meeting new people. I mean, the whole university experience, or you start working, that is when we start uh, like encountering new class interests. And if you're open enough, or you can, like, if they're like, not all class interests can be positive. So if, like, if we keep our barriers open and all, I think we can go beyond the class interests we have grown up in. So that,
By
I do feel
interest,
it affects it,
by
of course.
interest, what Marx means is not interest as Russ, but interest as
Yeah,
your
I
want,
understood.
what you want as your own
Yes,
aims.
I understood. Like per class.
Hmm,
Yes.
hmm.
Yeah, well, I
Right.
feel like once we go out into the world, it can
You
change, like,
encounter the other
interaction with
ways of
people.
thinking and looking at life,
Exactly.
and they
Yeah.
are related to social
Yes.
section from where those people come from,
Yes.
right?
Definitely.
Right. But he says, Marx argues that the dominant section of the society projects its own values, beliefs, its own ideology as a kind of universal one, as a kind of generalized one for the entire society, right? And so ideology also becomes political. That means it deals with conflict. If you remember, we talked about the term politics in the beginning, by which we don't mean party politics, right? What we mean is something more deeper than that, as how human beings engage with conflict collectively, right? So the conflict is ideological very often. Class conflict is played out in the domain of ideology very often. So the differences in thinking and looking at life and world and values and practices and belief clash because of class interest from where it comes from. So that is a very important idea in Marxism. And one of the examples, very interesting examples of ideology is what Marx calls commodity fetish. And by commodity fetish, he means that when we look at a particular commodity, an item, we think that it has got some intrinsic value, right? For example, brands. That particular brand is expensive, but it has got its own value, social value. And if you own it, brand of car or clothes or phones or whatever, it has got intrinsic value, which gives it social status. What it does, it hides the realities of economic exploitation that have gone into making of it. The workers being paid the 1/4 of the work, for example, or 1/5. So this product is made by workers and the labor. So labor has gone into making of that product, and there is an exploitation of labor that has happened in production of that product. But that is hidden, concealed. It's not revealed. What is revealed is as if the price is of that thing that you buy, and it gets its own aura. It becomes a kind of fetish. And I hope you know what is a fetish. Fetish is kind of attachment or desire for something which is not normal, right? Some sort of a deep attachment for something, right? And this attachment to things, right, is a distinctive aspect of capitalist society, that we start valuing things more than the people who produce those things, right? And that is a distinctive feature of capitalist society, as commodity fetish, F-E-T-I-S-H. So that is what ideology does. It masks the economic and social realities. So according to Marx, it's false consciousness, right? It's false consciousness. Now, the theory of ideology was later on modified, means the earliest version of classical Marxism or vulgar Marxism, which is based on the idea of base and superstructure, right? The base as economic, historical relationships of production and ownership of production, and superstructures are ideological things, ideological processes and phenomena, like philosophy, religion, state, education system, and literature and culture. That belongs to superstructure, while base is economic and historical. So the job of ideology is to make the underlying realities invisible. That's why it's false consciousness according to Marx. Now this was later on modified by other philosophers, Marxist philosophers like Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci, an Italian philosopher who who gave more importance to ideology, right? So ideology, according to him, is a very powerful phenomena. It's not just an epiphenomenon of base. Ideology has a greater role to play in historical struggles. Ideology has more power in everyday social life of human beings. And he argued that very often this ideology is not forcibly imposed on people, right? The ideology of the dominating class is not imposed upon the dominated class at gunpoint. It works through various modes of persuasion, convincing, various modes of propaganda, right? Like education, like media, like whatnot. So that the dominated class submits or consents to or agrees to accept the dominating ideology as its own. And this whole process, according to Gramsci, is called hegemony. Hegemony. So hegemony is when the dominated class makes the dominated class accepts its ideology without force, right? Through convincing, through media, through education, through literature, and so on and so forth, through discourse, right? So he says that there is a distinctive section of society called the civil society, which is not the political state society, but civil society. Civil society, which does this work of establishing hegemony of the ruling class over the ruled intellectually, right? So that is what is meant by hegemony. Hegemony is opposite of forcible imposition of ideas, right? It is when you make the person accept your ideas voluntarily, seemingly voluntarily, right? So that's a very influential idea by Gramsci. Any question that you have to ask about that?
No, sir. I mean, I want to like understand it a bit more before I ask questions. Yeah.
Yeah. So an example would be, for example, when women themselves argue that their subsidiary place in society is acceptable, right? Or they accept the norms of patriarchy and nobody has forced them to do that. They have accepted it. So that's how hegemony works. Or people of lower caste accept their fate as lower caste is kind of voluntarily accept your the superiority of other castes. So that is called hegemony, right? Nobody is forcing it, but through books, through education system, through discourses, through media, propaganda, you can say it's similar to brainwashing, right? It's similar to that. Is the notion of ideology in Gramsci clear? That ideology becomes dominant expression of hegemony through consent rather than force.
So, well, like, I mean, is it possible for it to become dominant only by consent in every situation? I mean, there must have been situations
Can you
where
come again?
the dominant.
Can you come again? I didn't catch your
Oh.
words.
Yeah. I mean, like, is it necessary for there always to be consent? I mean, of course, I support consent, but the thing is, how can it be so, like, I mean, there must have been situations where there was a dominant ideology, but not everybody consented to it.
So that's where the repressive mechanisms like police or the state steps in. Wherever persuasion and convincing does not work, there is violence that state launches. You are forced to accept it, the domination. So that's how the dominating class manages to stay dominant. And in some way, Gramsci is explaining why revolutions do not happen or they fail. Right? Unlike Marx, who was talking about Marx is in more prophetic mode, saying that capitalism will collapse on its own. But that does not seem to have happened. So you need an explanation. So Gramsci is providing an explanation, a Marxist explanation to why revolutions fail. Right? Is because there is another mechanism of education, philosophy, schooling, religion, which convinces people to remain in status quo, to maintain that status quo where people who are dominating will stay in their dominant position over others.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Similar formulation was made by a structuralist Marxist philosopher later named Louis Althusser, who is a very important formulator of notion of ideology. He goes on to say that there are two kinds of apparatuses in a given society. One is ideological state apparatus, something like civil society. But Gramsci is saying civil society is relatively independent of political society. But Althusser is saying that it is a branch of state society, state apparatus. It is owned by the state. So ideological state apparatus, ISA, and RSA, or repressive state apparatus like police or security or whatever, which has this power to impose things forcibly, take decisions forcibly upon people, right? So these are the two mechanisms. So Gramsci is saying civil society and political society. Althusser is saying these are both branches of the same mechanism called state. State ideological, repressive apparatus, and state repressive apparatus. And he points out that the education system is par excellence the state repressive, ideological repressive apparatus. It prevents revolution by brainwashing people. That's Althusser's formulation. But then when we study structuralism, we will look at this idea of ideology more closely as Althusser's ideology of ideology, right? Ideology of ideology closely. He uses semiotics and linguistics developed by Saussure and other structuralists to talk about how ideology is a system in which people's places are fixed. That means how people are made subjects into that system. Like, and he uses the term interpellation. Interpellation means when you hail somebody, like you say, there goes the policeman, right? So when you say there is the policeman, you are making that person occupy a place in system of police. So the place of a person in a system is decided through speech acts or language acts, right? So when you are born, the doctor says, look, it's a girl. So your place in social system is fixed. You are interpellated. And then it becomes a naturalized mode of existence. That's what he means by interpellation. Right? So these are some of the important ideas in Marxism. So when it comes to literature, how do we relate to it? We see literature, the Marxists would see literature as an expression of ideology, right? That means in many ways it reveals and conceals the economic and historical dynamics of the society, right? That means it's very often an ideological expression. that you are representing your class interest through your film or through your novel or through your poem, right? So literature is an expression of self-interest of a particular section of society. And very often Marxism praises, not always, but very often praises realism as a mode of writing. So Marxists valorize realism because that brings out realities of the society as conflictual. It reveals the real conflicts of the society, which are, in Marxist parlance, class conflicts. And a theorist named George Lukács, György Lukács, G-Y-O-R-G-Y, Lukács, L-U-K-A-C-S, a Hungarian philosopher, makes a distinction between socialist realism and critical realism. Socialist realism is that mode of writing which draws upon Marxist theories of society deliberately, right? And that was the enforced mode in Soviet Union. Everybody should write in Soviet realist manner, social realist manner. At the time of Stalinist regime in Soviet Union, people were forced to write literature as an expression of class conflict and embodying progressive ideas of communism, right? That's socialist realism. Lukács would argue that critical realism is another form of writing where you are offering a critique of society. You are criticizing the existing social values, culture, social system without or not directly drawing upon Marxism, right? You may not be a Marxist, but even then you are writing critically about society in a realist way, which is also welcome according to Lukács, right? Because Soviet Union became as totalitarian, as repressive, as violent as fascist governments. So Marxism does implicitly accept violence and totalitarianism, right? And crushing of dissent, which is characteristic of fascist society. So fascist and Marxist ideas are not very different at a particular point. So both are totalitarian. So later on, looking at excesses in Soviet Union, the people who were influenced by Marxism slowly got disillusioned with it, looking at their own imperial desires, right? And the violence in, say, for example, in Maoist ruled China, which was extremely violent, repressive, totalitarian, not very different from Hitler, right? So Hitler and Stalin, Hitler and Mao were not very different from each other. So there was a gradual disillusionment with pure Marxism, even in among Marxist philosophers, right? And even if you look at the term Marxism, then it's around ism kis cheez ka hai, to ek naam ka hai, Marx. So there is a tendency for personality cult and hero worship in the term itself, right? So if hero worship and violence and totalitarianism are taken, then Marxism and fascism are not very different from each other. So later Marxist thought moved away from the Soviet or the classical models of Marxism, and people critiqued Marxism, though accepting some of its strength, rejecting many points of Marxism as the time progressed, like Gramsci, like later on Althusser. And by 1968, it became a kind of thing to be of past. People wanted to reject it. And the later philosophers like Foucault would, and the postmodernists would turn away from this totalitarian and violent impulses in Marxism. So you have postmodern interpretations or uses of Marxism as well, which is critical of older forms of Marxism. So Marxism is not a single school of thought, but a kind of dynamic, changing orientation of thought. So socialist realism and critical realism is the distinction that you often find. And Lukács would also see Sir Walter Scott and many other writers as being critical of society, not necessarily Marxist, but having a progressive value. Right? Sir Walter Scott wrote about history, but at the same time, you would find that he reflected social realities accurately. So there is a kind of attachment towards realism in Marxism. And so there was one of the controversies that you find in later Marxism is between realism and modernism. And the debate happened between Georgy Lukács and Bertolt Brecht. Bertolt Brecht is a very famous German dramatist. Have you heard of his name somewhere? Bertolt Brecht. Have you heard of Brecht?
No, sir. I mean, I haven't, maybe the others have.
So Bertolt Brecht was a very important Marxist modernist writer who wanted to formulate non-Aristotelian theater. That means theater which is not dependent on identification with the protagonist or what is happening on the stage. So most of the films that we see are where you identify with protagonist and your sympathies are with the protagonist very often. And you are absorbed in the play or film, but he devised kind of techniques to distance the audience from the play. And these techniques were called the alienation effect. So he would use folk tales all of a sudden in a play. Play would be made of episodes rather than having a single plot. And he would, the main characters would not be heroic or larger than life, right? For example, one example is Mother Courage and Her Children, a very famous play by Bertolt Brecht. So he is a kind of experimental avant-garde writer in modernist tradition, like Joyce or like Eliot. And Georgy Lukács attacks modernism as being too subjective, too inward-looking, too individualistic to have any social impact on transforming society. It is expression of individual despair that you find in Bertolt Brecht, for example. Not Bertolt Brecht, that you find in James Joyce or Eliot's Wasteland or whatever modernist avant-garde writings that you can think of, right? To which Bertolt Brecht responds by saying that you should not read it so literally, right? This has some negative knowledge which is important. So expression of despair itself has a progressive impact on society. It reveals certain crises, and that's why it's valuable according to Brecht. That is, so Lukács attacks the ideology of modernism and upholds ideology of realism. And modernism very often was rejection of realism or representational art. The various avant-gardes that we talked about, surrealism, expressionism, Dadaism, that we talked about in, I think, when we were talking about Eliot, right? Later on, after World War, right, after 1945, many of the German thinkers who had gone to America, like Horkheimer, would return and start the institution that they had started called the Frankfurt School. So a group of scholars known as Frankfurt School included people like Horkheimer, Marcuse, Adorno, and Benjamin largely, and later on Habermas, who is still one of the most influential philosophers today. And these people would again hold that modernist avant-garde has some value. Though it's a negative value, it's more valuable, right? And this school tried to combine Marxism with psychoanalysis or Freudianism, which is a very important development. For example, Erich Fromm was a leading psychoanalyst of Frankfurt School. Have you heard of Erich Fromm?
Sir, who?
Erich Fromm, F-R-O-M-M, a leading psychoanalyst of Frankfurt School. So these are some of the important developments. Later on, in Britain, you find Marxism in form of Birmingham School of Cultural Studies, started by Raymond Williams, and later on continued by Terry Eagleton. In America, you find Marxists in form of Frederick Jameson and Noam Chomsky, right? So that is an overview of Marxism for you. Any questions about a generalized discussion of this? You can read up detailed accounts in the M.A.R. Habib book and Raman Seldon as well.
Okay, sir.
Any questions, doubts, queries, something that you've not understood?
No, sir, like no doubts, but like I'll read up more on it so that for like the in-depth understanding thing.
Okay. But if you have any queries on something that comes to your mind, please ask me.
Yes, sir, of course.
Others, what about others? Tatsam, Rohit, Khushi, Amatullah, anything that you want to ask me? Okay. Yeah, Tatsam. So if there is some problem that you're dealing with at your home, then maybe you can log out and attend to it, right? If it is urgent, then you can log out. Okay, some later developments in Marxism involve structuralist and post-structuralist reading of Marx and Freud. Yeah, like Althusser, Roland Barthes, and then you could also have more feminist readings of Marx, where people try to combine Marxism, post-structuralism, and feminism, right? Like, for example, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak is a major feminist, Marxist, deconstructionist philosopher, right? So, Marxism, the afterlife of Marxism, right, is that it got many ideas were taken on in later systems of thought from Marx, moving away from the pure whatever Marxism, classical Marxism or vulgar Marxism that existed, critiquing, questioning Marx, right? feminists would look at how gender and labor are connected. For example, women are not given their due when they work, right? There was no such thing like non-working women. All women were always working, but they were not paid. So there is an economic dimension to gender relationship as well. So feminist Marxists would take on questions of labor, exploitation, capitalism, and see how it is connected to patriarchy. So patriarchy and capitalism would share common grounds very often. And feminist Marxists would offer a critique of that.
Oh, yes, I read a paper once. I don't remember who wrote it. Like, I mean, I'll find out, but it was exactly on this about like how the labor that women undertook was not considered to be labor of sorts and not something that should be treated with like money, and about how women, since like even before we had banks or accounts, they were the ones who used to keep charge of the spending money, etc. And then I think there was the also this concept of I think gifting, about how it was to serve long-term interests. I can't remember the article, but it was about how, like we're building relations when we gift someone something, because it just means that they like eventually remember us or like try to give back in a certain way. And usually it all comes down to monetary means. So it was something I don't remember. Like I'll check and let you know. But that was
Feminist,
in that
feminist
article has echoes of what you said.
Yeah, and they would point out that why are women policed? Why are women considered as properties and owned? Is because they are connected to the questions of property. So the ideas of purity that are associated with women, idea of virginity, purity, have something to do with retaining the property. So if the fatherhood of the child is not established, then the questions of property become vexed. And that's why women's sexuality was policed by society. So that's how patriarchy and private property and capitalism go hand in hand together. And very often, even today, if you look at how women who are more educated and earn more do not get boys, right? And why? Because man is supposed to be the breadwinner of the family, main breadwinner of the family. Woman is considered secondary and subsidiary, dispensable or inferior in terms of economics of it. So Marxist and feminist analysis very often combine. And you will see that same happens with Freud. When we discuss Freud, there are some key classical ideas of psychoanalysis. Later on, they are modified by other schools, and they are taken on board by other thinkers in other frame. For example, Freud, who was very patriarchal and sexist, because that was the norm in Victorian times, right? And was taken over by feminists to critique the questions of sexuality and gender inherent in patriarchy. So afterlife of Freud also is important for us. We'll discuss that when we look at Freud. Anything that you have to say?
No, sir.
Anyone else? Any questions? You can type as well in case your audio is not working. Okay. So one or two important points before we stop, right? One is that idea of literature itself as having market and commodity is also something that Marxist perspective would highlight. So it plays a role in demystifying art. Art was seen as something that was superior, above commercial things like art, commercial things like market. But market has a very important role to play in literature as well. So literature as being commodity is also an important insight that Marxist would bring in, right? And another important idea that Marxists would emphasize is the idea of language as being social. Language itself as a practice is social. So these are two important other ideas that we need to think about when we are thinking of Marxism, because of its materialistic orientation. Okay, so now what we are going to do, I think if you don't have anything to say, then I think we can stop here for today. There are a lot of ideas that are complex. What we'll do is next week, we will have a presentation on the second essay by Terry Eagleton on ideology and forms.
Okay, sir.
So, but before that, we will have a doubt session about whatever we have discussed. And then we'll have a presentation. Right?
Okay. Yes, I'll read up on this so that, like, if I have doubts, I can ask.
Yeah. All of you should read up on Marxism from whatever sources. I have given a lot of sources, right? And the queries, doubts that you have, you bring in the next class, and we'll have a presentation. So I want one person to make a presentation on it, like Tatsam did last time.
Yes, sir.
So who
Yes,
is
sir.
who will do it this time?
I'll do it, sir.
Okay, Shikha will do that, right? Okay, so let's stop here for now.
Yeah. So once, just a second. Sorry to interrupt. Like, if I have doubts while I'm reading the essay, is it okay to contact you? Just like if I have
Yeah, you
doubts
can text
in
me,
between.
and maybe we can discuss it over a call whenever I have a free time
Okay.
sometime.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
So you can
Thank you.
text me while reading.
Okay.
Right?
Yes, sir.
And all of you can do that. And I also suggest put those questions in the groups
Okay.
so that you know what your questions are not only yours.
Yes, sir.
Many other people benefit by when we discuss doubts of one person,
Mhm.
right? Because other people have either not formulated their doubts or not read, or they are hesitant to ask question because of some other reason. They are shy or whatever, or how will I look kind of thing. So question answers always help the entire class.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Okay then. So we stop here for today.
Okay, sir. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you. And take care, Tatsam.
Yes, sir. Yeah. He left.
Yeah.